I believe that we're supposed to be talking about politics.
Yes,
And
tonight we were talking about the cleft, the divide.
I like politics too, because
yeah.
for the reasons I was talking to you about earlier, because it
You were saying some amazing stuff.
really seems to divide people more than anything else. I really have never seen anything draw the lines in the sand quite like political opinions. In some cases, very, very unimportant political opinions that really probably shouldn't draw divides between anyone. But it seems like they really have a tendency to do that.
Here's how the universe works. You ready?
Sure.
The secret
Go
universe.
ahead.
Okay. It's something called differentiation. And when it means with humans, I mean, for the beginning of the universe, it means that this great big sheet of space and time somehow individuates into gazillions of little particles, and they're in 16 different forms. But that's another matter for another time, which we've probably discussed 400 times by now. But the fact is, you put two humans in a room, and the first thing they do is they search for their common points. They have to have some common vocabulary. I mean, what happens if they don't even have any kind of language in common? They're in deep trouble. So they search for a language in common, which means that after checking to make sure they both speak English, or they both speak French, or they both speak German, or they both speak Swahili, then it's down to something they can talk about. So they look for something they can talk about. And what do they find? They find sports, they find politics, they find religion. These are all, basic things that we all know how to talk about. They might even find music or something like that. And, okay, so for 15 minutes, they check the things they agree on. They're trying so hard to be agreeable with each other. They're trying so hard to find common points on which they overlap. But once they've got it straight, what they overlap on, what do they do next, TJ? They look for the points on which they can disagree. And how do they spend the next 4 hours?
Probably arguing over one of those points.
Yeah, on which they disagree. So you've got two sports people, and first they check with each other to make sure that they're both interested in sports, then they check to make sure they're both interested in the same sport, football, soccer, whatever it happens to be. Then they check to make sure that they tend to follow the same teams, and once they've checked to make sure that they tend to follow the same teams, even if they follow the very same team, do you know what they do?
What?
They seize on different players on the team and different aspects of the coach's mentality and strategy and different predictions for who the fuck is going to win the Super Bowl. As if anybody in the world cared about who the fuck is going to win the Super Bowl. I mean, obviously, it's just a few nerds like you and me who don't care who's going to win the Super Bowl. But for the life of me, what is there in it? Well, it gives them a common vocabulary. And then it gives them something they can squabble about. And they usually don't kill each other over it. I mean, yes, soccer, they get into these hideous rows and battles and riots, but you're safer in a soccer stadium complete with riot than you are out on the street, walking in downtown London or something like that, where you're more likely to be mugged than you are to be attacked in a soccer stadium. It's a safe outlet. Unfortunately, with religion and politics, things aren't always that safe. And things haven't been as safe as they are today on any of these things for a long, long time. But basically, yes, we need, step one, find what we have in common. Great. Unity. Step two, find what we have different. And you know how the universe takes advantage of all of this stuff?
Mm-hmm.
All right, the universe is a search engine, constantly exploring her possibilities, constantly exploring her potential. And how does she do it? Well, she gets things together, and she gets them to find what they have in common, and then she gets them to split up and find different ways of doing things. And when they find different ways of doing things, they find new ways of expressing the cosmic potential, whether it's through an economy or sports or music or fashion or whatever it is that the cosmos happens to pick, even if it's through different stars taking different courses and slightly different metabolisms, even though they're all big, fat, round things that continually give off energy using the same metabolic process. But then they niggle. One star gives off one spectrographic set of lines, and another star gives off a slightly different set of spectrographic lines. And if they had consciousness, you can imagine what they would be saying to each other. My red is better than your red. We should outlaw your red, as a matter of fact. Only my kind of red should be allowed in this universe. And you can imagine what would ensue. However, actually a very big mistake to imagine that competition of some kind does not exist in raw, dumb nature at the level of stars, because stars do compete with each other. And they compete to see who can be the biggest pig. They compete to see who can be the biggest hog. They compete to see who can swallow the most stuff. And he who swallows the most stuff gets an edge. You know why? Because he has more gravity,
Ah.
which gives him an edge in the gravity wars. The great gravity wars of 300,000 to approximately now in the life of the universe. So competition, but I'm wandering too much.
So in your view, basically politics predates life.
Yeah, politics in one way or another predates life. Look what happens. Okay, you're one galaxy and I'm another galaxy. Okay, and the differences between us shouldn't really matter that much, right? Because live and let live. Where are we ever going to come into competition with each other? Well, guess what tends to happen, Snarfy? Eventually, one of us begins to get a little closer to the other. And guess what happens when one of us begins to get a little closer to the other? It's competition. And the big swallows the small. If you are bigger than I am, and TJ, you are much bigger than I am, if you are bigger than I am, you will swallow me entirely. I will disappear as an entity and become a part of your existence. Of course, I will make your existence more interesting and more complex, but guess what you're going to be up against someday, even if you swallowed me whole, which is what happens. It's called cannibalism by astronomers. Someday you're going to run into a bunch of other galaxies and be up against the same duking it out contest, because slowly over time the big are gathering others unto themselves in huge flocks called superclusters, huge flocks of galaxies. So right above our very heads at this very moment, this kind of competition is going on. And if you don't decide which side you are on, and you don't decide it right, or if the side doesn't get you, that's the best side, well, I mean, it comes, you're going to lose it. You're going to lose your identity. And why in the world would things in this cosmos care about their identity? Well, identity happens to be very, very important in this cosmos. I mean, it is true that as one quark, you look exactly like every other quark that has your basic characteristics. There are only 16 different kinds of quarks. And there are gazillions of you, and you all look alike, and yet you're separate. And you maintain that separateness for 13 billion years of traveling through this cosmos. For 13 billion light years, a distance of traveling across the face of this cosmos. Identity is very important in this cosmos, and not just to us human beings. So I'm overgeneralizing. I'm grossly overgeneralizing.
Let's take it back to Earth and modern times for a second.
Right.
The big hubbub these days is Wikileaks, and I want to know, among my circle of friends, there's a tremendous support for Wikileaks. I know that among other people's circles of friends, there is a tremendous call for Julian Assange's head to be mounted upon a pole.
Right.
So
Or melted with cheese and fed to God knows what sorts of animals.
So what do you think? Threat to freedom or ultimate expression of freedom? Somewhere in between. How do you see that issue?
It's both. I'm so split on this issue that it's ridiculous, TJ. I have dedicated a substantial portion of my life to fighting on behalf of freedom of speech. And I really, really, really believe in this stuff called freedom of speech. Plus, I have certain vested interests here. I've gone on all kinds of radio shows in the United States and especially in Iran, talking about the fact that Saudi Arabia and Egypt are really the big guys who want Iran smooshed. They're the ones who want Iran's nuclear capabilities taken out. They are secretly begging in their hearts that Israel will go out and do what they want it to do, which is getting rid of those damn nukes in Iran, because they think those nukes are the greatest threat not to Israel but to them. So here I've been saying this for several years on television, and here Julian Assange comes along and liberates the very internal documents in which the Saudis are begging and pleading for us to get rid of those damn nuclear facilities by whatever military means necessary. The bigger the attack, the better, at least as long as it's successful. So there's been a great justification for things that have been on my mind for a long, long time, and being a person with an ego and all that kind of stuff, not to mention identity that likes to hold together and stuff like that, I am pleased with that. But on the other hand, I don't want to see people killed who happen to be friends of ours somewhere because, in Palestine, for example, among the Palestinians, if they think you're siding, if your neighbors think you're siding with the wrong side, you're dead. You are dead. The politics there is done differently than it is here. Plus, there's all of our, God knows, snooping on other people. I mean, we're not the only ones to snoop on other people. The French are snooping on us right now. The Japanese are snooping on us right now. The Chinese are snooping on us right now. It's done not just among nations between enemies, it's done between friends. And there is risk here. Plus, when Julian Assange talks about the fact that one of his motivations is to take the bastards down, which of us does he see as bastards? It could easily be you or me. Yeah, people are fairly arbitrary in their choices of who the bastards are and who the good guys are.
I have a friend. I have a friend who is very concerned about organizations like WikiLeaks being used by the government in, leaking fake information to these agencies, knowing that people will believe it if it's leaked through a third source, and the government acts like it's something they don't want out there, which I think
and
is
I
is,
and
is a
I've been concerned about the same thing because look how easy it would be to set up this big kerfuffle over something called WikiLeaks and use it to leak information that's extremely helpful to you that nobody's going to believe if it comes out under official government imprimatur.
right,
Um,
exactly. Like, the example my friend used was basically, imagine if Dick Cheney during the whole drumming up of the leading to the war in Iraq had leaked documents, to the effect of, oh yeah, Iraq does have weapons of mass destruction. It's all here in these secret documents that got leaked, quote unquote.
right. Yeah, it would have been a great way to do things for Dick Cheney, not a great way for you and me. I mean, Iraq is one of the biggest mistakes we've ever made. I can't find us, at least at the moment, thinking about it only marginally, I can't find a single justification for being there, and it just bled us dry. It's one
Yeah,
of the
of
reasons.
course. But I mean, the thing is, that is an example of how something like WikiLeaks could be used uh,
Absolutely, you are dead
by
on
by
target.
those in power to basically promote their agenda.
Well, on the other hand, I would like to see the WikiLeaks from Saudi Arabia. I would like to know what they're doing with their over $70 billion of promoting Wahhabism around the world. I would like to know who they're supporting and why. I would like to see the WikiLeaks from China. I'd love to know what they're up to. And the unfortunate thing is that WikiLeaking is easiest here in the United States because the United States has greater freedom of speech than Canada, which has been going through serious freedom of speech issues, than England, in which you can shut people up using libel laws, than France, in which you can take Brigitte Bardot to court for saying that killing a cow in the halal manner is cruel, that is, bleeding it to death, same as in the kosher manner, and you can be taken to court and find enough money to keep other people from ever saying anything of the sort again. I mean, there's a lot of censorship around this world, and the country that has the least of it, to the best of my knowledge anyway, is the United States of America, and that's the thing, ironically, that seems to indicate that yes, we'll see a lot of WikiLeaks from here, but where are the WikiLeaks from China? If Julian Assange is really serious about what he's doing, where are the WikiLeaks from Saudi Arabia?
Yeah. The other thing, and I think this is kind of the central issue of the 21st century. At least it is to me. Maybe you don't agree, but it seems to me like, from September 11th, 2001 on, the central issue in American life, from my perspective, has been this question of, do we want to be free or do we want to be secure? Do we want to have liberty or do we want to have safety? Basically, I think that's, when you go into this whole TSA scandal that's been big for the last few months with the full body scanners and having to take off your shoes at the airport to travel, and now I believe they're putting some homeland security propaganda in WalMarts. Um, there's all these very strange kind of disturbing things happening where people are giving up little freedoms piece by piece in order to feel more safe and secure. And I don't know. To me, it doesn't make me feel more secure. I feel more secure knowing that I have my freedom, but it does seem to be the big divisive issue that has really
It's a
kind of.
it's a really it's a really tricky one because you and I both feel the same about freedom. It is extraordinarily important. It is really, 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 really important stuff. Um, and but on the other hand, you have to maintain the capsule that allows us to have freedom within it. And that capsule is a capsule of Western civilization and the smaller capsule of the United States of America. And if somebody destroys that, and it can be destroyed, then everything goes. The way that when the Roman Empire, look, the Roman Empire had more freedom than any previous empire in the history of the earth. If you don't count the Greek thing as an empire, and the Greek thing didn't really last that long. The Greek experiment that we think of in the days of Pericles, which lasted approximately 40 years at most. But the Roman Empire, with its freedoms, lasted for a long, long time. And when the Roman Empire collapsed, in addition to the fact that people starved to death, people died of the plague, people died of they died at the hands of all these invading tribes that just wanted to steal their property, slit their throats, and fuck their wives or their children. Half the population of Europe died, but one of the things that died the most was freedom. And one of the first things that died was freedom. When the Roman villages began to suspect, when Roman towns began to suspect that they were under attack, they took Roman towns were really remarkable because previous towns had been built with walls around them. All cities had been built with walls around them forever because a city was a place that could be attacked at any minute. The Romans were so successful in spreading their empire that they built city after city after city after city with no walls. And instead of walls, they had a kind of information flow. They had a theater and a bath. And the bath was there to let people congregate at leisure and talk. And the theater was there to pump new information and surprises and startlements into the human mind. Well, what happened when Rome began to fall to barbarians, when it came under threat of barbarians that it could not control, it could not stop them, what happened was that the baths, the stones for the baths and for the amphitheaters were torn away from where they were. These buildings were torn down and they were re-erected as walls. And all of a sudden, people who had lived in an open landscape, which not only symbolized the openness to other towns, other cities, other influences, other sorts of people, but also provided that easy access. All of a sudden, they were living with a whole new mentality, the mentality of a walled mentality. And so you have to balance. What will happen if the whole culture goes the way the Roman culture goes, and versus the difficulties of or the mistake of taking the things that nourish us the most and turning them into barricades, turning them into barriers that cut off ourselves. One of the greatest symbols of this kind of thing came when the Chinese put together their Shanghai World's Fair. The Shanghai World's Fair, which I may still be running in China, I haven't checked recently, but had been going during a good part of 2010, was the biggest World's Fair in the history of the planet. And it was astonishing and extraordinary. And every country in the world tried to put in stuff that would just make your eyes fall out. They wanted to put in buildings that would represent their aspirations for the future. And America didn't have a building because we don't have a public fund for the arts. It's been whittled down to just about nothing and didn't have enough money to cover something like building a building at the Shanghai World's Fair. At the very last minute, Bill Clinton and some other people got together and tried to raise funds from a bunch of big corporations, and they built a building. That building represented the post-9/11 American spirit. And whereas every other building was built to dazzle the imagination, get you thinking about entirely new kinds of frontiers, this one building was built like a fortress. It was built without windows. It was all defensive walls. Well, what happens when you put up an entire building, walls, ceiling, the whole thing, of nothing but thick block walls with no windows? Who suffers the most? You do, because you live in darkness. And the architecture that we chose for that building said to the world, we now no longer believe in ourselves. We choose to live in darkness. And that is scary when we let our civilization die.
Yeah, and when you were telling the little story about the Romans tearing down their bathhouses and theaters to build walls around their formerly secure and cities that they formerly felt safe in without having the walls, I just started thinking about all the talk that was going on a number of years ago, and I guess it's probably still going on, about building a giant fence on our Mexican border.
Oh, that scares the shit out of me for the same reason it scares you. It's
And
this.
I think
When,
I think my good friend George Carlin said, walls can also keep people in, uh,
right.
and that's basically what the message I'm getting from what you were saying about our contribution to the World's Fair in China.
Well, I get it too. I get it exactly from all of these ideas of building huge walls and keeping aliens out. And because when nations are on the decline, they become very xenophobic. They hate outsiders. They hate foreigners. And that's a problem. I mean, America has benefited from every group of foreigners that ever came over here. It first came the Irish, and they were considered to be below human, totally below human. By whom? By the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who had first inhabited this country. And despite the fact that they were considered to be subhuman, they became some of the most remarkable contributors to our politics and God knows what else, but our politics and our sports in particular. They became invaluable American citizens. And then came the Italians, and the Italians were considered to be the greatest rubbish on the face of the earth, and nothing but a danger, and the only thing that they would ever do is stab you or kill you or turn the country into mayhem, violence, and idiocy. And the Italians turned out to make great and huge and amazing contributions to American culture. And my people, the Jews, who came in first in a burst in 1842 when there were revolutions all over Europe, and a lot of people who had, quote, liberal ideas were being persecuted. That was when the word liberal first showed up on the scene, and they fled, and then later migration from 1890 to 1910. And that population turned out to be east to the American dough. So we have benefited from every one of these migrations. And James Fallows, who is a national something or other, national correspondent for The Atlantic. He's one of their most senior editors, and he's one of the most astonishing in his comprehension of what makes Western civilization tick. Wrote a book in which he basically said, look, once upon a time, the Japanese and the Germans came up with this hypothesis that bound them both together. And the hypothesis was, when you have racial purity, you create really superior people. And the Japanese had been working on their racial purity for about, at that point, 1,200 to 1,400 years. So they felt they were ahead in this game. And the Germans had just become aware of racial purity, and they were working their asses to catch up with the Japanese. Well, that hypothesis got thrown into the world in World War II. And that hypothesis had an opportunity to demonstrate whether it was sound, whether it bore any relationship to reality. And the biggest nation that was the antithesis of this idea of racial purity was the United States, a totally polyglot people. I mean, England is dominated by the English and France is dominated by the French, but America is dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who came from England, and the Irish, and the Italian Americans, and the Jewish Americans, and on and on and on. And this polyglot nation, this nation that has no racial purity whatsoever, whipped the asses of the Japanese and the Germans. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that mongrelness is better than racial purity, because the fact is America had greater natural resources. America was supplying most of the oil, most of the energy to the world at that point. America had iron and steel. America had an industrial system that had been developing for almost 200 years. And there are all kinds of other reasons that America had a bigger population by far. So there are all kinds of reasons that America may have whipped the asses of the Japanese and the Germans. But one very good possibility is that the mongrel nation of the United States helped us whip their ass. And when God knows what sort of people who think that they've been here forever when they haven't. I mean, even the Native Americans have not been here forever. They got here around 1,150 years ago, according to most anthropological evidence, and according to some more outlandish anthropological evidence that I happen to enjoy, they might have gotten here 32,000 years ago. But one way or the other, they are immigrants. We are all freaking immigrants. And when we forget that, I mean, the ethnic purity fixation, the fixation on keeping out foreigners, you are absolutely right. It is very close to that political intolerance that makes us toss out people who are off by one shred of an idea. It's the same as the absolute ferocity that gets into a room. You know, people can be friends for a zillion years and never talk politics, but once they talk politics, if one discovers that he's a Republican and another discovers he's a Democrat, if one discovers that he's on the left and another discovers on the right, there is a good chance that friendship is about to end. Because you were right, the trivial has enormous power in the realm of politics.
Yeah, that's why it fascinates me. I want to talk. We were talking.
Well, do you have any theories about this, TJ?
I've always thought that what you were talking about, the World War II thing, and I would just liken it to the basically the racial purists versus the mongrel nation, as you put it. I would just see that as somewhat akin to incest versus mating with someone who's more genetically distinctive from you. It's always better. I mean, even in dogs, mutts tend to be more healthy than purebreds because there's so much inbreeding. There's so much.
And interesting because I have a friend who's a Great Dane, and well, we're really friends, and his name is Zeus. And I've had various other Great Dane friends over the years, and I never realized until what you just said. My Great Dane friends have not lasted long. You know, they have about a 10-year life. Other dogs will last 15 or sometimes 18 or 20 years, but not Great Danes. They come into your life as this great, galumphing, wonderful presence, and then whammo, they're gone. And it probably has to do with exactly what you're talking about, overbreeding.
Yeah, and I think the same could be. I mean, it might be stretching a little bit to say that the same could be true of nations, but I think there's definitely an advantage to a nation that's going to be accepting of new ideas and going to, house a number of different cultures and make everyone feel like they can be part of something larger and yet still have their racial identity if they want it. They don't have to have it. You can totally shun your racial identity in America if you want to. I mean, I don't walk around talking about the greatness of my Scottish and Czech heritage or anything. But I think that's part of what makes America such a great country.
Well, the polyglot thing cuts in two different directions. It cuts genetically and it cuts monetically. You know, Richard Dawkins' idea that there's a thing called a replicator, and it's this form of substance that voraciously and, as he says, selfishly makes copies of itself. And one of them is the gene, and that's a physical replicator, and the other is the meme, and that's an idea or a set of ideas that is just ravenous about gathering new people unto itself. It can be said about this nation that both our genes and our memes are polyglot. And this is the great information nation. This is the nation that has gloried in gathering information from all over the place and sloshing it together in amazing ways, more than any other nation. And it works in part through this balance of conformity enforcement and diversity generation. We do a lot. We let a lot of kooky communities take off. I mean, in the 1950s and the 1960s, California was the kookiest place in the world. And then California ended up by the 1970s being the leader. It brought us the future. Year after year after year, it brought us the future. And it still does. Was there any relationship between the kookiness, including the kookiness of people like Ronald Reagan way over on the right, and the George Bush Society, or whatever it was, way over on the right, which I actually was planning on infiltrating. I was going to give up a year of my life to infiltrate the John Birch Society in order to expose the radical right. But at any rate...
why did that never happen?
That never happened because I got a group of friends together at Reed College when I was 18 years old, and it was my freshman year, and we were all going to do this together, And so I wrote a letter as if it came from a radical right winger, as if I were a radical right winger, to some one of the heads of the John Birch Society, and he wrote a letter back and said, "I'm so glad to hear the way you think. It is very exciting to me. I'm coming into Portland," and he gave a date. And can we please get together for lunch or dinner or something? Well, as soon as I showed that letter to the other two guys who were part of this cabal, guess what they did?
Back down.
They they disappeared. They disappeared real fast.
uh,
Their feet were so cold you could have made popsicles on their toes. Um, they were nowhere to be found within a matter of mere seconds. And
yeah, yeah.
I was left holding this letter in my hand with my name on it. And Reed College is not an easy place to go to school. They threw between 1,800 and 2,400 pages of reading at you a week, and it was all original sources. If you were going to do Thucydides, you were going to read Thucydides, for God's sakes. If you were doing the Greeks, you were going to read the Greek. Well, thank God you didn't have to read them in Greek, but reading them in English is not easy.
uh,
Um, so so I have to admit, I chickened out on that one. I never showed up for the meeting with the
yeah,
head
well,
of the
without
society.
your moral support, it's yeah, it's not
It,
as easy.
yes, it's harder. It's
And,
harder. But one way or the other, having all these crazy and nuts has been has done a great deal of good for us, because if nothing else, a nut or a crazy person on an extreme of an issue helps you define your own position. But the thing that's been disturbing me is that the nuts on the left and the nuts on the right, I hate to say that because one of my good friends, David Swindell, is the editor of Newsreel blog, which is way over on there on the right side of things, and he thinks I'm a right winger. Well, I mean, you try to get at things you regard as truths, and you try to get at things you regard as truths, whether they're on the left or whether they're on the right, and you try to fuck fashion and do what's right. And so, if occasionally somebody on the left or somebody on the right thinks that what you're saying is true and resonates with their beliefs, good. It can mean it's a truth. But one way or the other, I'm concerned because we have gotten so bogged down, and this is not an original thought by any stretch of the imagination. We have gotten so bogged down in the battles between left and right that we can't see above our heads. And I don't think that all life can be defined on a ruler on the dichotomy between the 0 point on the left and the 12-inch point on the right. I'm sorry, you got to get off the fucking ruler if
so,
you're going to understand anything about real life.
let me ask you: do you go to the polls and vote for the politicians?
Yes, I go to the polls and vote for the politicians, but I don't feel I'm really voting for anyone or anything. But only someone comes along periodically, like a Barack Obama, who projects a blank screen and allows us to project all of our hopes and desires onto him. Doesn't define
See,
himself. Lets us define him.
yeah, I mean, I encourage people to try to convince me that voting matters, but I just don't see how I can accept that premise.
I
Because
think it is an
to
extremely
me,
important.
well, let me
It's
just
because okay, go ahead. I'll
let me
shut
just
up.
have a small rant here, because to me it seems just so blatantly false, the idea that it matters, that I can't really conceive of how anyone attaches any importance to it. Because if you don't fall into lockstep with one of the two major parties, then I don't see why you would vote for either of them. And I'll give you an example with this recent tax debate that's going on, the one Obama has already caved in on. Basically, the deal. The Democrats wanted to extend
Right.
Bush
Yep.
tax cuts for everyone and stop the tax cuts for income over, I think it was $250,000.
Right. Exactly.
The Republicans want to make the Bush tax cuts permanent in all tax brackets for all time. And I want to know where's my voice? Where is the voice of the person who says let's end these tax cuts in all brackets and fix the deficit? Because people say, oh, you can't raise taxes during a recession, and I just why not? I mean, the jobless people have no income, and therefore taxes aren't going to matter to them, and people on lower tax brackets are only going to see the tiniest tax hike. And I don't even want to call it a tax hike because it's just the repeal of a tax cut that was meant to repeal anyway.
Right.
$200 more in taxes over the course of like a fiscal year for most people. So I want to know. No one's going to the poorhouse for $200 a year. So I mean, only rich people are giving up any sort of serious tax cuts, and they're the ones that can handle it. I mean, Donald Trump is going to be fine. So
Right.
my point is, and I know I'm kind of going about it in a roundabout way, but why should I vote when there are so many issues where neither party represents my vision for America, what I want to see in the future? I mean, it seems like you could make, I guess, the argument about lesser of two evils, but that argument's never really impressed me very much.
Well, you should vote because it's the only. It is a check and balance within the system, and it's not much of a check and balance, but it's a lot more of a check and balance than we had before voting. And it's a lot more of a check and balance than we had before universal suffrage. It's a lot more check and balance than we had in the days when only the people who had a substantial amount of money could vote, or when only the aristocracy in the early days of the British system could vote. It is a way to get people to use a word I hate because it came up during the Bush era and I always associated with George Bush, but to use a word I hate, it is a small check of accountability. It's a very small check of accountability because, in fact, the two candidates are really competing with each other over who can raise the most money. But occasionally, a candidate may come along with an idea. Now, that doesn't happen very often. The Republican success of the last 30 years has been based, especially in the last 15 years, on training everybody to say exactly the same thing. You have certain catchphrases, and everybody must repeat them in every single interview often enough that no matter which 15-second cut of the interview is taken, it will have those key lines. Job killing taxes, for example, has been a big one with the Republicans. The Democrats, I mean, we're so disorganized because I'm a registered Democrat. We're so disorganized that we can't do that to get our points across. But it goes back to a balance. This is going to sound really absurd, but it goes back to a balance between conformity enforcement and diversity generation. You need a certain amount of repetition of central themes to get your point across to normal human beings. And normal human beings are the ones who, they're the ones who, fortunately, because of the vote, have some small say in what goes on in the country. And then within that context of slamming home over and over and over again your most important core message, you have to periodically be able to generate something new. Because it's the new stuff that's going to get us out of this stuff. I mean, I literally regard the way out of left and right as up. And I literally regard it as that because I see space development as humanity's next thing. Now, it's not going to save us over the next 2 months. It's not going to save us over the next 2 years. But over the next 20 years, hell, it's going to make a difference. Over the next 40 years, a bigger difference. Over the next 80 years, every bit of difference in the world. The countries that go up are the countries that are going to stay up. Period. The countries that don't go up are the countries that are going to slide down, no matter what the hell happens. Now, wait a minute. That's a little bit too much on the subject of voting because the fact is, look, I have a very hard time finding the time to vote because that's my writing day, and I'm under constant deadline, constant pressure to generate stuff, to write my stuff every day, and especially a wise man said, named T.J. Kincaid, said to me earlier tonight on Skype, I'm on a typed conversation on Skype, well, Bloom, you're getting older. You got to write faster. And that's a genuine deadline. Death is a real deadline.
Yeah, that's a pretty serious one. You can only avoid that one for so long.
Yes, exactly. So, and I've got tons of ideas that I want to get out there, or at least I fool myself into thinking I've got tons of ideas that I want to get out there. Who knows if it's for real, except that I do have this 6,400 chapter document in the computer called the Grand Unified Theory of Everything in the Universe, including the Human Soul. So presumably there's something in there somewhere.
Just publish that, Let's publish that in 50 volumes.
But the point is, it's very hard for me to get out and vote. So what does it take to motivate me to vote? Well, all the rational stuff I've told you, which I do believe, that we do have some minor break on the system. We do have some minor control, and that minor control over the course of time matters a hell of a lot because it makes the difference between us and an oligarchy, us and a kleptocracy, us and all kinds of archies. The fact is that it takes fear to get me to vote. It's when I really get frightened that the Republicans are going to take over. And I dislike Mitch McConnell. I loathe. John Boehner, I absolutely despise. I think these guys are so slick and dishonest that it's ridiculous. Now, of course, I watch the thinking of my friend David Swindell, who's over on the right, and see how much he distrusts Barack Obama, and the distrust is beyond the moon. And realize that he feels the same way about Barack Obama that I feel about these two bozos. But one way or the other, it's fear of the bozos that gets me into the voting booth. And hoping that my vote, along with the votes of lots and lots of other people, will somehow keep these guys from going too far. And in fact, it worked to the extent that they only got the House of Representatives. They did not get the Senate. Which means that even though they're crowing over a landslide victory, it's not a landslide victory. They don't control everything. They did not win everything by any stretch of the imagination. So, TJ, your vote counts. It's just very hard to grok it. It's very hard to understand it in your heart of hearts. And so, if fear usually is the great motivator.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that in the instances where I have gotten out and voted, it's been fear. But I guess that I just maybe I'm overly optimistic, or maybe I'm overly pessimistic. One of the two, in thinking that this is pretty much as bad as it gets at the time.
Well, I voted for Barack Obama because of hope. I voted for Barack Obama hoping that he would in fact represent something new. I was particularly convinced by the astonishing way in which he used the internet and radically inventive new ways to campaign. I thought that if he could bring that innovation into the government, we'd have a radically changed governmental system. But none of it's been brought into the government. And whatever knack he seems to have had during the campaign is gone. He's no longer engaging us in any way. Us who once upon a time he was so good at motivating. And is he going to get his mojo back? Well, a bunch of analysts who know this stuff much better than I do, because politics is not my major thing, but a bunch of people who do know this stuff have said, look at the number of people the number of presidents who were in a miserable state of affairs after only 2 years in their term. And in their subsequent 2 years, they pulled themselves out, and they pulled themselves out magnificently.
Well, one of the things that always fascinates me, one of the things that always fascinated me was that actually, I believe in this point in his term, Ronald Reagan actually had lower approval ratings than Barack Obama has right now. And of course, among Republicans, he is now revered as a god-like figure of infinite perfection who did no wrongs. I did want to get off the topic of voting, but not entirely, and kind of go over to this the civil rights, because one of the things that frustrates me, and I'm sure it probably frustrates you too, is that civil rights causes are so agonizingly slow-moving. And I sometimes find myself wishing, despite knowing that I don't really want this, but I sometimes find myself wishing that there was just a benevolent dictator to just wave a wand over society and grant everyone equal rights overnight. And, in a lot of ways, it does seem like that's the way it happens, because most of the time when these civil rights battles are won, or when the major victories are won, it's either something that comes through the courts, or it's something that happens via executive order. It never seems like it's the will of the people. It doesn't really seem like it's always the popular vote that gets that stuff done. In fact, it doesn't usually seem to be that, but that's getting back on the topic of voting. So, right. Why do civil rights causes move so slowly, and am I wrong for wishing for a benevolent dictator to come and fix society?
The benevolent dictator would be the death of everything.
That's what I thought, but I can't help but desire it from time to time, because it's
right. Well, they take a long time, because most forms of cultural change take a long time, and one of the things that we fail to recognize in America is the multi-generational nature of change and the multi-generational nature of projects. And we think we can achieve things in this illness, this sickness shows up the most in business, where we are required to show a quarterly profit. If we're only going to show quarterly profits, we will never do anything for the long-term sustenance of a company. You have to look at the long term. The civil rights struggle for blacks has been going on since at least the days of the Constitutional Convention, because the Constitutional Convention was almost torn apart by the issue of slavery. And then we had a civil war, and then we had Jim Crow, and then we started to have civil rights movements. And those movements, in my lifetime, when I first got involved with civil rights causes, specifically for equal rights for blacks, I was 16 years old, and I became the head of a social action committee for the Unitarian Youth Group, which, of course, is perfectly natural when you consider that I'm a Jewish Zionist atheist. But at any rate, and so that was my first involvement. And let's see, how old would I have been? Something like it was 1959, roughly. And then when I got involved in the music business, initially I was championing the rights of white middle class suburban kids. And that's all I cared about was those kids. And so I had nothing to do with black versus white issues anymore. All I knew was that if I put a black artist in my magazine, my audience didn't like it. They didn't care. They wanted people who reflected them and their identity. And then in 1975, I got involved in the music industry on the record company side of things and saw that black artists were treated just as miserably within the bounds of record companies as they had been treated and with redlining, which back in the late 1950s and 1959, which I was opposing. Redlining said, we'll give a black guy a mortgage only if he lives in a black neighborhood. If he tries to buy a house outside of a black neighborhood, sorry, no money available whatsoever. It kept blacks in a ghetto. It kept blacks in places like Harlem. And the same thing was going on in the frigging record industry. If you were a black artist, no matter how terrific your music, no matter how successful it was commercially, no matter how much money you made for the company, there was a little pool of black employees, and only they could work on your act, and it was totally unhip. It was like getting shit all over your face if you were white to work for a black act. Now, that is really hard to imagine now, but that's the way it was in 1975. So I fought from 1975 until, well, actually, it wasn't that long a fight. From 1975 until 1982 to get this music out of the ghetto and make sure that not just black employees would work on it, but white employees would work on it with equal enthusiasm. And I'm thinking it was a long time because the struggle, the younger you are, the longer a year is. But actually, the struggle only took us 7 years. 7 years from the time I started working with people like Stephanie Mills and Carl Carlton and Shaka Khan, building her career when she was an unknown, to the time when Michael Jackson and Prince crossed over in such an astonishing way that it was no longer called crossover, because it is no longer regarded that they had started from a black base and then crossed over to a white base. They just had a universal base. That was it, and there was no name for it, no label for it anymore. But that was the result of something that had started in the 1780s in those debates about slavery. And from the 1780s to 1982, that's a lot of time. That is really a multi-generational project. Is it worthwhile to do multi-generational projects? It's like voting. You know, it may seem like you're only doing a small thing, but you are not. You are not. If you put your back into it with all your might, you change things. And your effort will somehow count in the long run. Does that in any way answer the question? Because what disturbs me is...
It does answer the question, but I'm still disappointed because I'm too selfish to care that much about some future generation that gets to live in a better world. I want to live in a better world right now. So,
well, the civil right that bothers me the most is education. The civil right that bothers me the most is not high school education or grammar school education or even preschool education. It is a college education. And it's the equal ability of anybody with the talent and the work ethic to be able to get into a school no matter what the income is of his dad or mom. And it's the best way to run a country is to take maximum advantage of the talent pool available to you. And it's not something that should be done by kicking kids into school who don't really belong there, kicking kids into college who don't really belong there and have to go through all kinds of programs to bring them up to speed, because those programs, from what little I've seen, and I've seen too little, those programs do seem to be failing. What counts is kids who've worked their fucking asses off and deserve to go to college should not be stopped by any consideration of money whatsoever, ever, 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 ever. And that is a fundamental civil right that means a lot more to me than whether a gay couple, and I have a lot of gay friends, and I've represented the gay community. I was yanked into it when the gay community found its soul in an anthemic kind of music, disco music. And despite that, I am not concerned about whether my gay friends have to have civil marriages or whether they can actually have church marriages. It doesn't matter to me, as long as they can get married in one form or another. What does matter to me is if they are poor and their kids cannot get into college, but their kids are freaking brilliant. That is a sin and a crime. So that's my major civil rights beef at the moment. What's yours?
I don't like the fact that even when there is a huge movement towards something, let's take the legal marijuana issue for instance.
Right.
I don't smoke marijuana. I don't like marijuana. I don't give a shit about it one way or the other. But I know that there is a huge movement in this country, a considerable number of people, something like 30 to 40 something percent of people favored the decriminalization of marijuana, and yet
Right.
they have no political representation. I don't know if that's necessarily a civil rights issue, but I kind of think it is, because that's a to me that's a class of people, the people who use that substance, which is a pretty harmless substance. So
Well,
something like that, something like
one of my
that.
friends was just glorying in the fact last week that he's now moved into a state where medical marijuana is legal, and he has gotten himself a medical marijuana, whatever you get, and he's now smoking medical marijuana. And I tried to warn him, well, okay, we start with a basic premise. Any good thing in overdose is a poison, and many poisons, when you use them in moderation, turn out to be tonics. They turn out to be remarkable substances. And I've seen people who had real talent just piss their talent away doing too much marijuana, doing it all the time, and in the process becoming the work ethic has disappeared.
Yeah, it can have a negative effect on someone's output. That's for sure.
Right.
But there's no reason why someone shouldn't be able to make that choice for themselves if they want to.
Well, they have to be able to make that choice for themselves, because if we're going to let them kill themselves with
But
tobacco,
not in
or
this country,
kill
though.
other people with
Yeah,
well, it's getting there. It's getting there slowly, and
slowly
it's
but surely. But that's a civil rights issue I think is important. But
right.
it's not just limited to that. It's just, to me, there's a lot of ideological things that seem very persecuted in America that I wish you could talk about more openly and realistically, but they seem to be certain suppressed
Well, a
elements.
lot of that is self-censorship, and sometimes self-censorship is very good. I mean, America has anti-Semitism, but it has less anti-Semitism by a long shot than Germany had in the 1930s, and in part that's due to self-censorship. Um, but then when does self-censorship go really off the rails? Like the Saudis have spent a huge amount of money, and so have the other. There's this big Islam lobby. It's 57 countries. It spends a ton of money. It outspends the Israel lobby $13.28 to 1 penny. And its huge machinery built this idea of Islamophobia, when in fact Muslims were not being beaten up any more than you and I would be beaten up when we go out on the street. Mosques were not being burned down and attacked. The Quran that was supposedly going to be burned, the pastor who had a congregation of 50,000, 50 people, 50 people. That's all he had. And despite that, he got a call from the president and from the Secretary of State telling him, please do not burn this Quran. I mean, the real problem of Islamophobia scarcely existed. But because there was a huge amount of PR money to spend, the notion that Islamophobia was all over the place has become a serious issue, and where it's been picked up the most is in the Islamic world, because I've gone on Iranian television, first on their English language global network, Press TV, debating the subject of whether America is Islamophobic, and then, the most remarkable of all, a one-on-one debate with an official from the Muslim Brotherhood, the group that assassinated Anwar Sadat, the group that gave us Saeed Qutb, the philosopher behind Osama bin Laden, the group that is a mother of all terrorist groups. I got to debate him one-on-one on Iran's global Arab language television, only because of the extent to which Islamophobia has been used as a phrase and an accusation against America and spread around the Islamic world to vilify America. So self-censorship has a lot to do with all of this stuff. I welcome the fact that at least Iranian television is open enough that I can express my point of view, even if they set me up in every conceivable way to discredit me. The fact is, look, my ancestors did not get to express their point of view arguing with Joseph Goebbels in Germany on German radio.
Yeah, that's
Um,
not something that would have happened.
yeah, so
I do wonder though. There was a little bit of fear mongering going on the part of the Republican Party and Fox News primarily. And this is a story that's kind of interesting in that it was a big story prior to the election, and then after the election, it sort of disappeared. So,
right.
and that's of course the quote unquote Ground Zero mosque, which apparently had some controversy attached to it, and now seems to no longer have that controversy attached to it now that the election is over.
Well,
So
the Ground Zero mosque thing wasn't just being used in the United States. It was also being used in the Islamic world, again, to promote this idea of Islamophobia. So when I've been on Iranian television on the Islamophobia issue, the two things that have been brought up are Terry Jones, the guy who wanted to burn the Koran. And by the way, in the Islamic world, it is considered that Terry Jones did burn the Koran, and it is considered that he was set up for this by the government, and the calls that Terry Jones received from Obama and from Hillary Clinton in the Islamic mind do not exist, at least not in the minds of the people who put together Iranian television, Iranian official global television.
it doesn't. I wish that surprised me, but it doesn't.
And also, the 9/11 mosque thing has been used as a major, major issue in the Islamic world. Now, what would happen if I decided I wanted to set up a synagogue 2 blocks away from the Kaaba in Mecca?
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Right. First of all, I wouldn't be
You
allowed.
you would not be permitted to do so.
No, I'm not allowed in Saudi Arabia because I'm a Jew. I'm not allowed in Saudi Arabia because I'm a Zionist. There is apartheid against Jews in the Arab world, and no one is calling the cat black. Although I hate to say that about black cats, it's an insult to them, and I hate to say that about anything that's black. It's an insult. But no one is calling the truth of this issue, and that is there is radical apartheid, and the people who are committing the apartheid are the ones making accusations of apartheid when they're not really up against apartheid. That's a crime. That is a crime against truth. At any rate, so I couldn't get into Saudi Arabia to begin with, and I could not build a synagogue anywhere in Saudi Arabia. Not anywhere, much less anywhere near the Kaaba, which is where you go to make your pilgrimage. Just a great big square meteoric stone that has been a subject of pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia since before Muhammad was born. It is the most sacred thing in Islam. I would be able to get nowhere near it. A synagogue would be able to get nowhere near it. A church would not be able to get anywhere near it. An atheist shrine would be able to get
I don't
nowhere
know if we
near
don't.
it.
I don't. I hope there's never an atheist shrine to begin with. But
Yes, well, it's a oxymoron. So
but
I apologize to both the ox and the moron.
yeah, I agree with you, and my point to that would be, it's exactly because they wouldn't let us put a church in Saudi Arabia or a synagogue in Saudi Arabia that we absolutely have to make sure that they have the right to put a mosque anywhere they want to, that they can afford the land to put it. So,
And Michael Bloomberg made that argument, and he made it very passionately, and he believed it with all his heart and soul, and it came out of his family's background. And he's, a nice Jewish boy, but I disagree. If we're supposed to be look, I've fought for goddamn freedom of expression, and I will fight for the right to put mosques in just about anywhere on the planet. But there is this practice in both Christianity and Islam of planting, because they have both been imperialist religions, of finding the most sacred site of the people you defeat and mounting your place of worship on that sacred site as a sign of just how defeated and gone they are. For example, Mexico City. In Mexico, the leading churches, the most important churches, are built on Aztec sites. They're built on Aztec holy sites. They're built where the Aztec temples were demolished. Not that the Aztecs were nice people. They were mean, nasty, cruel, vicious, and they would tear out the hearts of up to 8,000 people a day and offer them up to their sun god. That fucks. That sucks. That should in no way be supported. But the fact is that
Howard Bloom takes a definitive stance against the heart removal of the still beating hearts of the sacrifices to the sun god.
Right, but one way or the other, the Christian churches raising the temples of the Aztecs and then mounting their own churches on those very sites to form the base of a permanent humiliation. I'm sorry, that is not acceptable. And it's not acceptable when Islam has done it. You know, there's this big thing in India because the supposed birth site of Rama, one of the major gods, Rama, in India, has a mosque squatting on it. Why? It was built there to accomplish the purpose of saying, you people are now shit underneath my feet. and that is not an acceptable architectural statement. So architecture speaks. I love the architecture of Dubai. I love everything it stands for. I love the freedom, the high aspirations, the glory, the creativity, the whole damn thing. And it has a right to sing those messages. And I hope it sings those messages more and more to the Islamic world, which needs its modernism, its pluralism, which has tons of modernists and pluralists. No, they are not necessarily a majority, but they are a huge number, and they should be supported in their right to have a voice in every way conceivable. But you can also make negative statements with architecture, and the 9/11 thing was one of those negative statements, and the irony was, and one of the reasons you haven't heard anything about it anymore, is because the 9/11 mosque would have depended for its $10 million on foreign donations, and foreign donations usually come from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia built a huge mosque in Harlem. But guess what the problem is with this mosque near 9/11 as far as the Saudis are concerned?
What's that?
My understanding, I have been told just in the last week, that the people behind the 9/11 mosque have a kind of a Sufi background, and Wahhabis consider Sufis to be apostates. And what are you supposed to do in Islam with an apostate, a guy who turns his back on Islam? You're supposed to kill him. You're not supposed to give him $10 million to build a mosque. You're not supposed to encourage the notion that his version of Islam is Islam, because it's a heresy. So that seems to be the problem with the 9/11 mosque. It was too close to what we would call liberal Islam, even though it was not liberal Islam. It was just too close.
I do want to talk about economics. I'd love to stay and talk about the mosque, but it's kind of a dead issue at this point.
Right.
And, I'm sure people are probably sick of hearing it. That people got sick about hearing about it 2 months ago, so I'm sure they don't want to hear.
Well, there's
too
a
much
little
about it now.
There's an interesting little sign of how this has slumped in public interest. The whole Islam issue has slumped dramatically in public interest, and that is, you can customize your Google News page.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I like to keep track of, aside of how China is doing economically and a bunch of other things like that, and what's happening in theoretical physics, is what's happening with the world of Islam. And normally I track that by going to a Sharq al-Wasat, which is a Saudi publication and stuff like that. But many days I don't have time. All I get time to do is look at my goddamn Google News page. The part that's supposed to keep me up to date on what's going on in the Islamic world is practically dead, because there aren't enough articles appearing in the English language on what's going on in the Islamic world to keep the little part of the page alive. People just aren't interested. They've lost interest.
Yeah, that whole 9/11 was 10 years ago now, so
right.
We're the shelf life is kind of expiring on it. But I do want to talk about economics a little bit, because you did write an entire book on capitalism, for fuck's sake.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you. I saw you showed me in your emails to Swindell.
David, yes, to Swindell, yeah.
Who I want to call David Swindle because he's on the other side, but I'll respect.
Oh God, no.
I will respectfully pronounce his name correctly.
Yes.
I saw that you were talking about Bernie Sanders, I think.
Yes, Bernie, the socialist who is not affiliated with either the Democratic or Republican Party.
The socialist senator who did a somewhat of a filibuster on the tax issue the other day.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, and you kind of said, you're not usually a fan of him because he's a socialist, and you're obviously not a socialist. But I wanted to ask you, and I know that you had some issues with this being a false dichotomy, but why are socialism and capitalism necessarily enemies? I mean, I see capitalism as being kind of the spirit of industriousness and the idea that your labors should be rewarded, and I kind of view socialism as being the same in a lot of ways. I mean, the only difference that I see between the two philosophies is that one system holds hard labor to be of less value than the other. And I think socialism taken to an extreme is dangerous, obviously. We've seen that. And I think capitalism taken to an extreme is dangerous. We've seen that too, especially...
I think you need both. I think you need both.
Yeah, well,
I
that was
think
the
you
kind
need
of
both.
point I was...
Yeah, you need both government involvement and you need the private involvement. What the people who say that the market, first of all, the market under Milton Friedman tried to make Milton Friedman the economist, who was an influential figure about 20 or 30 years ago, and 30 years ago was considered completely politically outside the bounds.
Still popular among conservatives, by the way.
Oh yeah, but he was brought in by conservatives and he was made mainstream by conservatives. And he brought in an absolute worship of the market. And that worship of the market went so far that it said that the market has perfect economic information. And it acts on perfect economic information, as if the market somehow does something superhuman, because none of us have perfect information. And if the market had perfect information, why does it go up and down? Why does it crash, for God's sakes? It's not perfect.
Well, the straight up laissez-faire capitalist would say that the crashes are all due to interference and regulation.
Yes, they would, and they'd be crazy, because the crashes, as one of the things that the Genius of the Beast tries to demonstrate, is that we've had crashes, ups and downs, as long as we've had economies, and we've had economies as long as there have been humans. We've had an economy of one sort or another since we made the first stone tools 2.5 million years ago, and ups and downs are the ways things go, not just in economies, but in just about everything. But aside from that, yes, we need both. One of the points I'm trying to make to my friends who believe that the free market is the be-all and end-all of everything is that once upon a time, around 1818, we Americans got very unhappy with the quality of weapons we'd used in the War of 1812 against the British, and we decided we wanted some improvements. So we put it. Now look, there had been a big argument at the end of the 1800s, I mean the end of the 1700s, between two guys, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Thomas Jefferson had wanted no money ever to be spent by the government. Everything had to be done by private individuals, and especially private individuals living on their own small farms. And that's how we all had to live, on our own small farms, as far as Jefferson was concerned. No cities, for God's sakes. He didn't want them. Madison had a very different, or Hamilton had a very different point of view, and he felt that people who do commerce and business are important, and cities are just fine, and the government should have a certain amount of money to spend on things on its own. Okay, well, the Hamiltonians took over in 1818 in the sense that they started to dedicate some government money to doing research and development on how to improve arms, how to improve rifles, or whatever the equivalents were at the time. And that research took a long time. It took from 1818 until 1851. And by the time, plus, private industry was working on a similar kind of project. Private industry was trying to take this really high-tech gadget that only super rich people could afford, that you couldn't carry around with you because it was much too delicate. And they were trying to make a version you could carry around with you and that could be inexpensive enough that just about anybody could buy it. Those were the watchmakers of Connecticut, and these guys lived near each other. Plus, there were the new farming machinery people, the Eli Whitneys, who were also working on this problem. And the problem they were all working on was this thing called, now, ready? This was the revolutionary idea that was actually going to change the way humans live, period. It was called interchangeable parts. And it was developed in large part in government armories. And in 1851, this real high-tech freak in England, who had a lot of money available to him, decided to throw the ultimate show of all the new high-tech stuff that people have been working on ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1750. They'd been working on it for 100 years. He was going to gather all this high-tech shit from all over the world. And he was going to show it off and make people's eyes pop out. He was going to make them salivate until they drooled down to their knees. And his name was Prince Albert. He was a real gadget freak. So he got another gadget freak to build him a building of a kind nobody had ever seen before and was previously impossible with previously existing forms of architecture. It was all glass and steel. And it was called the Crystal Palace. Because you walked in, it was like a greenhouse, all glass and steel. Nothing in the way. And the Americans brought, well, this thing that had been developed in government armories, the interchangeable part system. And they showed it off against projects from Russia and projects from China and projects from all over the world, and amazing, amazing stuff. And projects especially from England, which was way ahead of everybody else in terms of technology at the time. And guess what the hit was of the Great Exposition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace? It was something that the people attending this thing called the American system, interchangeable parts. Well, it took 60 years, 55 years, talk about multi-generational strategies and multi-generational projects. This was it. Started in 1818, and it took until approximately 1908, 90 years later, before a guy came along with an idea of how to really make this interchangeable parts thing work. It was called an assembly line. And that was Henry Ford. So we give Henry Ford, a private industrialist, the total credit for inventing the mass production of the automobile. But Henry Ford couldn't have done it without the government participation. And it wouldn't have been done without the Henry Ford. So we need both the private industry and we need the public sector, but we need them creating what are called orthogonal ideas. What's an orthogonal idea? Again, go back to that ruler with the left on the left and the right on the right, right? Mm-hmm. And people arguing about where we should be on this ruler, left or right. Orthogonal means going straight up. Orthogonal means going at a total angle that has nothing to do with the limitations of this line. And we got to get off this line-like thinking. We got to get off of this what is it called again? This just two, either or thinking. I mean, I've been tracing the history of logic, and guess who started this either or thing? That it's either one thing or the other. Aristotle. He said if two things are opposite, then either A has to be true or B has to be true. Sorry, supposing they're both wrong.
Yeah.
So we need a lot more orthogonal thinking than we have right now, especially when we're up against China. They're taking everything. The Japanese took everything that we had and owned it and made it better than we'd made it back in the 1970s and the 1980s, and that began our economic woes. Meantime,
that was actually one of the most depressing parts for me of reading the Lucifer Principle. The part where you outlined how many U.S. patents ended up making Japanese companies rich because they're the ones that actually ended up embracing the ideas.
Well, and it makes me sick, too, because the same thing is happening right now. A couple of weeks ago, I was invited to an event down in Washington. It was a meeting of the 14 research and development heads of the Department of Energy's 14 research labs. And these are big operations, and I've never been invited to meet these people before. So I got myself in a bus, and I worked my tail off on Aristotle and the genius of the new book, the God problem in a bus, because they have Wi-Fi in a bus and electricity in a bus if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, sorry, it doesn't work. but I happened to be working, and I got a lot of work done on that bus, and then got up the next morning and went off to this meeting with the 14 R&D heads, and then every single one of them made a presentation. We were all sitting around a big table, and every presentation had the same words in it, but they were words buried in the presentation. They weren't even the subject of a full sentence. They just appeared and disappeared again, and they were all on-the-shelf technology. Now, what does on-the-shelf technology mean in a meeting of the 14 research and development heads of the 14 research and development labs of the Department of Energy? It means they got all kinds of stuff they've developed already, for God's sakes. All kinds of stuff that you could just go through and look through to see if there are new products there. All things just waiting to be turned into real things that you and I can use. Are they paying any attention to them? It was surprising they even mentioned them. As I said, they didn't. Not a single one of them gave them a full sentence. So there is stuff out there to be scooped up and developed. And one of my friends in the space community. One of the former members of the Big Bang, or no, the Space Development Steering Committee, the group that has Buzz Aldrin and Edgar Mitchell and people like that I run. One of them tried to teach me a lesson. He's an engineer. And he said, look, if you let basic scientists rule the roost, all they're going to do is basic research, and they'll never develop any practical products. You have to have engineers in there taking the stuff that the basic scientists do and turning it into real things. And he's right. It's another matter of balance. You need both. It's not a matter of left or right. It's not a matter of basic science or engineering. It's a matter of both, for God's sakes. I mean, can you imagine the two of us going into a bakery and demanding that, no, don't give me the bread. Just give me the flour. I'm going to eat flour. Okay. You're going to eat just flour. And I say to the person behind the counter, no, forget the bread. Forget the bread. Just give me the yeast. And I insist on just eating yeast. I mean, this would be a little bit wacky. You need the flour and the yeast and some water and a lot of pounding the stuff out and flattening it and then blending it over on itself and flattening it again, and heat. The application of heat for the right amount of time tends to be useful too. But if we're to have an argument about, well, why don't I just eat the heat? I think we should just eat the heat. We'd be lunatics. So it's time to get off this either or thinking. I mean, 2,300 years of it. Aristotle started it 2,300 years ago. Isn't that enough, for God's sakes? Now, you could argue, but it's gotten us this far. Yeah, but we got a lot further to go. I mean, it's the Alice in Wonderland line. Alice shows up in this crazy little ditzy place that the Red Queen has put together or something like that. It's one of the Red Queen's more maniacal little things, and it's a place where everything is constantly moving. And Alice says in desperation that to get anywhere you have to run very, very hard. And the Red Queen says, yes. I mean, to stay in place. Sorry, I blew the whole thing. To stay in place, you have to run very, very hard, says Alice. Yes, says the Red Queen. And to get anywhere, you have to run even harder. Well, that's the way things go. There was this little phrase I threw at you tonight when we were Skyping on the Big Bang Tango Media Lab. And it was about, if we just, you had said, and I thought it was you were making some amazing observations tonight. TJ makes amazing observations in his spare time, which you probably already know because you watch his YouTube videos. But at any rate, TJ was saying that most people just they don't want to go into the future right now. They just seem to want to freeze things the way they are. And I said, yes, freezing things the way they are is the way to end up on the junk heap of the past. And to stay where you are, you have to work really, really hard. You have to keep moving. And what that means is China's going to move ahead, whether we move ahead or not. Japan's going to move ahead, whether we move ahead or not. India's going to move ahead, so is Brazil, whether we move ahead or not. Where does that leave us if we just stay in place? Behind. Way behind. And is there a problem to being behind? There sure as hell is. Because if you're at the bottom of the social totem pole, everybody takes out all their problems by beating the heck out of you. America gets its way these days in the world, and when it wants to send troops to some place like Iraq, it sends its troops to Iraq, and if the Iraqis don't like it, sorry, we just shove open their door and kill them. Although we try not to do that. I admit we try not to do that. But shoving open their door, no, we do an awful lot of that. And if we don't want to be the people whose doors are being shoved in, we have to stay at the front of the pack. Plus, we owe an obligation to humanity. If we don't stay at the front of the pack, then the Chinese are going to be at the front of the pack. And the Chinese do not believe in freedom of speech. And if you and I, TJ, are so impatient about freedom of speech, we believe in it so profoundly that even the wrinkles and flaws in it right now bother the hell out of us. And in fact, we are in the remarkable position of being able to debate about whether a WikiLeaks is a good thing or not. In China, they couldn't debate that because, first of all, the WikiLeaks wouldn't happen ever.
Did you hear about the China's farcical response to the Nobel Peace ceremonies?
Yeah.
It was one of those instances of the world becoming so ridiculous that I wasn't sure if I was living in a a parody world for a second.
Well, and the person who got the prize, they forgot to notify the person who got the prize. So the
Yeah.
person who got the prize wasn't at the ceremony because he hadn't been notified or he hadn't gotten the notification. Well, if you're the Chinese government, can you get to anybody you really want to, or what? If they really wanted that invitation to get through, believe me, that invitation would have gotten through.
I just thought it was. What the funniest thing to me about this story is the number of countries. I think it was something like 13 nations.
16.
16.
16.
Who backed out of the Nobel Prize ceremony at China's request.
And that included Brazil. And Brazil is ahead of us in alternative energy. That is, it's ahead of us in terms of biofuels, way ahead of us in terms of biofuels. And it's way, 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 way ahead of us in deep sea drilling, the thing that we fucked up on, and the BP, the oil spill.
Yeah.
Although you could argue that the British were the ones who fucked up on that. But still, it was American companies, British companies. It's a great global international adventure. But right now, the people who have the cutting edge in that are Brazil. And Brazil is turning against us because they want to be friends with the Chinese. And that's just a sign of what can happen in another 10 years when the Chinese are way ahead and we're way behind. And I don't want to see us way behind because
I also am amused by the fact that the two nations that we're in wars, or whatever you would call them at this point, in Iraq and Afghanistan, also backed out of going to the ceremony at China's request. So
yes, and they're supposed to be our patrons, and or we're supposed to be their patrons, and they are supposed to have puppet governments that are danced around by us. But guess who really controls the government of Iraq? It's Iran. And guess who's also making a bid to control the government of Afghanistan? Iran. The very country that puts me on its television shows. All the bizarre things in the world. But, I'm set up as the bad guy, and you never believe the bad guy, right?
no, of course not. I just thought it was funny, but it's not funny in some ways, but I am amused by it in others. So I guess we're pretty much at the hour and a half mark here, so we should probably wind this up. Is there anything you'd like to close on, Howard?
I think that balance is really the name of the game right now, and it's a dynamic balance. It's a swinging balance. It's a balance that keeps moving forward. It's like the balance you maintain when you're riding your bicycle. You don't just stay in place. If you just stayed in place, you'd fall over. No matter how good your balance is, eventually you'd fall over. You keep moving. You keep moving lickety-split, and that's what has to happen with an economy. It's a balance of opposing forces, but you never, never let it stop moving forward, ever. And that forward movement depends on new ideas, just new ideas, new information, and taking off the shelf or on the shelf things and turning them into gizmos.